Hey everybody, it's Matt Shu from Upright Health, and today I'm answering a question that I got recently from Jeff Castaldo. Jeff asked about the TFL stretch. So he saw the TFL stretch that I did a video about several years ago, and he said, since the TFL performs internal rotation in addition to flexion and abduction of the hip, can you add internal or external rotation of the hip during the kneeling stretch you demonstrated? If not, can you indicate a stretch using external or internal rotation of the hip to stretch the TFL? Believe it or not, I've been shown stretches using hip external rotation and others using hip internal rotation, which does not logically make sense to me. I'm not going to use either until further inquiry from professionals like yourself. Your advice would be much appreciated. Cool. So, Jeff, super good question. And it's a good question because when we talk about muscle function, a lot of times we get caught up in the described muscle function in textbooks. So when you're in anatomical position like in a textbook, when you go up like this, you are using TFL. So it's helping you with flexion. It can help you with a little bit of internal rotation. It can also help with abduction from anatomical position. So it's important to remember, though, that if you're not in anatomical position, what that muscle is doing is going to be very different. I think you're talking about, with reference to the external rotation stretches, I think you're talking about probably like the pigeon stretch. I think you're probably talking about something like this, and I've seen that too. And when I was trying to figure out how to stretch my TFL, I thought that makes no sense to have this out in external rotation. But I do believe you're probably able to get a little bit of stretch through the TFL in a certain way by doing this, because TFL goes here and then comes down along that way. I think for some people that is going to feel like they get some TFL stretch. They may also feel like some glute min, glute medius stretch. So I don't think that's necessarily wrong. It's just not stretching it probably the way you were hoping. So in the TFL stretch that we talked about, it's where we are actually shifting back, moving over so that the hip is in adduction, and then moving forward to trap that TFL. So in case you guys haven't seen it, it's basically down like this, moving back, getting adduction in the hip, bringing this foot over, so we're still keeping this whole thing in adduction, and then shifting forward to get that TFL. Now, you're asking about internal and external rotation, Jeff. So at this point, I feel my TFL getting stretched. If I add a little more internal rotation, so my back foot, so let me get set up. If I add a little more internal rotation, I've screwed that up. Hang on one second. There we go. I'm doing this all backwards. So, all right. So I'm going to back up, move over, and then start shifting forward. So now I feel it in my TFL. If I add internal rotation to the hip like that, I feel that for me, stretching my TFL in a little bit of a different way. So it's okay at that position, as long as I feel like I'm getting the right thing. If I add external rotation right here, I pretty much don't feel it. I feel maybe a little bit of stretch, and it's actually feels like more like QL and obliques, and a little bit of tissue up by the top of my ilium, by the top of my pelvis. So, but again, if I go for the internal rotation, for me, that feels like I get maybe a smidge more. Keeping my pelvis tucked, I get a little bit there. So can you add internal and external rotation to this stretch? You could. It feels like internal a little bit. External for me doesn't do anything, but I could conceivably see that helping somebody who has some sort of weird tightness in their hip that way. There are some other TFL stretches, standing ones that I think have been, that I've seen that were pretty good. So, it's just kind of like a normal hip flexor stretch like that, and then going like this. So as you're rotating yourself and your hips are kind of opening up this direction, you start to feel tension kind of at the high quads and right at the TFL. and that is actually also giving you hip extension and internal rotation, internal rotation of the hip, which in this position feels like it stretches the TFL. And I know right now you're saying, wait, internal, external, wait. So again, to review, right now, from anatomical position, TFL will, yes, give us flexion, internal rotation, and also help us abduct out like that. But actually, if you notice, going out like that, I kind of get a little bit of external rotation. That can conceivably help a little bit. When we go into something like a standing TFL stretch, we go here, we're going into extension, which is counter to the flexion that the TFL can do. And then we're doing a little internal rotation of the hip joint by twisting this way. But that's because from this position, TFL can be tensioned. It can be tensioned in this position. If I go this way, I don't really get much on there. So the reason I wanted to address this is not because I think there's any really pressing thing about stretching the TFL, but I think the idea that all stretches need to address the muscle functions of the textbook definition of those muscles is kind of flawed. You need to be looking at what the muscle does in what position, look at where you're having trouble with that muscle, and address the trouble in some position that's relevant to that. So, like hamstrings, your hamstrings can be tight in some positions and not in others, and so you need to figure out how to address those types of mobility issues more specifically. So anyway, Jeff, I hope that answered your question in a more principled way. It's probably more principled in general than you were expecting, but hopefully that gives you some ideas. I am going to stretch out my left hip now because my right hip feels phenomenal now, and that one wants a stretch. So anyway, thanks for your question, Jeff, and thanks for watching, and I hope you remember that pain sucks. Life shouldn't.